Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're joining us for this episode. And today I have Mike Morrell. And Mike is an author, a creative, a mystic. I actually ran across Mike first time, 3 years ago or more, maybe the first time I read Richard Rohr's book, The Divine Dance. And one of the things I noticed is that it was co-authored by Mike Morrell. So those of you who are watching on our video, our YouTube, you can see
strain really hard and see the fine print.
Mike Morrell. This book has been endorsed by Paul Young on The Shack and Bono, and I mean every other kind of person that I really have learned to love these days. And so I thought, gosh, and I was hunting around on Twitter, and I found Mike on Twitter, and I sent him a direct message, and actually he responded, and he's got, I don't know how many thousands of Twitter followers you have. So I was really shocked that you responded. And then I've been hunting you down ever since, right? So I've been trying to do this.
After that early promising indication of response, Mike's ADHD kicked in.
But you know what was funny is Brian McLaren had challenged me to go to the Wild Goose Festival last year for the first time. So I went, and I was riding a golf cart up to the main area after parking. And this guy in the golf cart says, "Are you Fred Heron?" And I said, "Yeah," and I was like, it was a guy that used to go to my Vineyard Church in Kansas City named Josh Burton.
Yeah. Do
you know Josh?
I do know Josh. Yeah, very well. We lived in Raleigh together for years and went to church together there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So anyway, we connected because it'd been a while. He hadn't heard my journey and my whole crazy story. And then I hadn't caught up with him and his wife. And so anyway, we had some great time together there. And then I said, well, I'd really like to meet I was hoping to meet you there. And then he gave me your cell phone. So, so you can blame Josh if you want.
You got to do. Yeah.
Anyway, welcome to Spirituality Adventures. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Absolutely. It's really great to be here, Fred. I appreciate it.
I like to get just a little bit of origin story for people who don't know you, and tell us kind of like where you were born, where you grew up. Give us a little bit of your family of origin, and particularly as it relates to your spiritual journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in the God-haunted, Christ-obsessed American South. And, I'm a product of the very tail end of 1979. So kind of growing up in the 80s and 90s and coming of age in that soup of my parents' own spiritual journey. My mom praying to have a born-again experience after watching the 700 Club on television with Pat Robertson. And, doing it night after night, saying the sinner's prayer a few times in a row to make sure that it really stuck, So from an early age, kind of was involved in a lot of churches and a lot of what you might call a fundamentalist fervor that I think makes a lot of sense in my parents' backgrounds, having kind of disruptive home lives, that they really appreciated the certainty of the iteration of Christianity that they came to that said, hey, God has given us the answers to live, and we have them, and we can give them to you too. And so, I had my own born again experience at age 4, saying that same sinner's prayer, repenting for my life of waste.
You've done so many bad things by the age of 4. I'm sure
you have no idea. So it was, I think my dad grew up nominally Methodist. My mom grew up nominally Catholic, but, they found their groove in the Southern Baptist Church. until that began to be stale for them in some ways. And meeting a couple who owned a bookstore in our town of Douglasville. One night they prayed at their table, knowing something was different about them, and received a baptism in the Holy Spirit experience that for them enabled them to quit 20 plus year smoking habits cold turkey. They never looked back, never
Wow.
picked up another cigarette. So suddenly we were Pentecostals. And, we were going to a bona fide, independent, holy roller church with tambourines and dancing in the aisles, and such a culture shock, but way more fun than Baptist church. So I was down with it. And, sure enough, following my parents' footsteps, had my own baptism in the Holy Spirit experience shortly after that at age 9. And, then there were some scandals involved in that congregation. And, my parents got a bit turned off. We started going to an Assemblies of God church that was a little bit more buttoned down, but still had that Holy Ghost fire in some ways. And so it was kind of meandering through that journey. But my parents eventually got disillusioned with that church too, and more or less stopped going to like regular congregations. And so by high school, I was a little more on my own. I was homeschooled also for 7 years during the midst of all this, because my mom was just such a high achiever and wanting to do what was right and protect me from the evils of a secular education. And so, but by the time, high school age rolled around, I was hanging out with this group of conservative Presbyterians, but they had like a big theater emphasis, a big arts emphasis. And so they would like write their own musicals during these summer camps of the arts. And, the boys and girls even had desegregated youth group and could talk to each other, unlike what the homeschooled contingent of my AG church wanted to implement. So felt like a breath of fresh air comparatively. I begged my mom after the second camp of the arts one summer to let me go back to school in 10th grade. And, finally she relented. I think she was tired of fighting with me, because if I had been unschooled as opposed to homeschooled, there's this whole unschooling phenomenon now where you kind of innovate the curriculum with your children. You let them follow their bliss and kind of learn what they want to learn. That probably would have been more suited to my disposition, because I would end up like on the one hand reading the encyclopedia for fun and reading like entire science fiction novel cycles, because I was so interested in like particularly Isaac Asimov and all of this stuff around robotics. And, he packed a lot of actual science into his storytelling. But on the other hand, I would be like years behind on some subjects in my official curriculum. So, finally got to go back to public school. And so just kind of growing up as that denominational mutt and seeing all these different backgrounds gave me both an appreciation for where I came from, but also a certain relativity, because my friends who grew up Southern Baptist and were only Southern Baptist, or who grew up Pentecostal and were only Pentecostal, or who grew up Presbyterian and were only Presbyterian, they thought they had the corner market on reality. They thought that, God handed stuff down to them, and that they were the unique and special chosen because of the emphases that they had. And I just kind of saw behind the curtain by the time I was a teenager, and like, y'all all think this. You can't all be right.
Exactly.
Doesn't mean that you're all wrong either, but there's a little bit of a hubris problem going on here. So
they finally got it right after 2,000 years after Jesus.
Exactly.
They finally nailed it. They got
it. Exactly. So,
oh man.
Yeah, I mean, relative to my current journey, I think 2 things happened that were impactful, maybe 3. One is in this Presbyterian church one day, I was like a volunteer worship leader, even though I didn't play an instrument and could barely carry a tune in the bucket. But Presbyterians had way lower standards than Pentecostals for musical excellence. And so I was like helping prep for a service, and I was just sitting down in one of the chairs, and I popped open my Bible to John 17 and read it for the first time. And John 17 is this, I think it's typically called like the great high priestly prayer, but it's this very mystical prayer by Jesus about divine and human interpenetration, about the sort of indwelling of the Father in him and his indwelling in the Father, and then how they are indwelling Jesus' followers and Jesus' followers are indwelling them. And it's not just them, but all the followers who are to come in succeeding generations are just going to be dwelling in the love and the presence of God, where you kind of don't know where one ends and the other begins. And it's just like, I've never heard this preached before in all of my years of sitting in church now. And it was just this like revelation. It was like, what is this? And Jesus is praying it. Presumably it's, true. How do we experience this? And it was an open question that after I finished high school and as I was entering college, I started hanging out because of a cook in my summer job restaurant where I was a dishwasher. Discovered this house church that was practically in my backyard. And in this house church, it was very different than any kind of congregation I'd ever been a part of, because they all took responsibility for the direction of the church. There were no paid clergy. The gatherings were open and participatory, and they were really into Christian mystics, which I hadn't really even heard of before that. I didn't know there was such a thing as a Christian mystic. Yeah. It sounded like one of those quote unquote new age things that my mom was so scared about. But when I discovered Brother Lawrence and Jean Guillon and Francois Fenelon and Michael Molinos, who were four favorites of this particular small but global house church movement that I gradually became a part of, I discovered that they attempted to really lean into that John 17 kind of description and descriptions that I began to find all over my Bible that I didn't previously know, that, we can have like a firsthand experience with God, not only a sort of ecstatic out of body experience as was, promoted and experienced in the Pentecostal world, but even that sort of still and quiet space of spending time with God in my innermost being and spending time with recognizing the divine presence in others. And so that kicked off a decade with this house church movement where it really leaned into that and also began reading outside of those four mystics. And, that plus the advent of the internet and its ability to connect weirdos from all over the country and all over the planet really changed my life forever.
Yeah. Wow. So you went to college at Berry College?
Yes.
Where's that located?
Berry College is in Rome, Georgia, which is sort of North Georgia area. And it's one of the world's largest college campuses, even though there are only about 2,000 students there.
And you did creative writing there?
Yeah, I majored in journalism and I minored in creative writing and religion, which, some of my atheist friends will say those two are the same thing.
Yeah. And then I remember you told me your wife had been involved in the vineyard at one point.
Yeah.
You met your wife at college or after college?
No, before. We met in high school. We met at the Presbyterian church youth group. Yeah. And yeah, Jasmine, had a background in the vineyard, first in Virginia, where she grew up, and then when they moved to Georgia. So kind of rolled deep in your background. And as I was saying before we started recording, I was very, sort of secondhand influenced by the vineyard vis-a-vis the Brownsville revival, which swept through the Assemblies of God. And I still kept in touch with my AG friends, even after moving on to the Presbyterian church. And so loved that sort of early 90s vineyard worship, which in a lot of ways kind of harkens to that devotional and erotic stream that is present in mysticism and Christian mysticism through the years, arguably starting with Bernard of Clairvaux and his commentary on the Song of Songs, where you start, seeing this idea of viscerally entering into the bridal chamber. It's it's a lot of, cross-gender role play, frankly. And it's amazing that so many evangelicals do sing love songs to Jesus, even though, it often gets maligned as people begin to deconstruct their faith. But, it's fine for heaven to meet earth with a sloppy, wet kiss, if that's what you're
I was just going there. What's funny is we were doing that song before I went to rehab at my church, and we did the wet sloppy kiss line, but everybody had only heard it on the Christian radio, where they changed it because the Christian radio stations across America didn't want wet sloppy kiss.
Oh, really? I didn't even know that because I
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
listening to Christian radio by then. What did they change
Yeah,
it to?
I wasn't either, but they said, what was it? Do you remember, Matt, what they changed it to? Oh, I forgot. They changed that line and just
Huh.
play it on all the Christian radio stations around America.
Wow.
So
Okay.
we would have people come up to us and say, "That's not how the song goes." And of course, that's how it was originally written. And
Yep. You're
and
like, I've got the album right here.
and the author changed it just to let it be played on Christian radio. That's crazy, you know.
Yep. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. It really is. And as an aside, like I've gotten to know so many CCM musicians over the years. And, some of them probably don't want to be named publicly, but some of them, everybody knows about, people like Jennifer Knapp or Derek Webb, who I grew up listening to and who have become friends because they're, on this journey of just sort of, deconstructing their faith and reformulating something that feels healthier and more vibrant. It's just like, so many of us are on a journey and, so many others are afraid of that journey, but it's kind of like, come on in, the water's fine.
Right. Yes. I used to say belly up to the bar, but I've been in recovery now for a few years, and
yeah, that was a popular renewal slogan in the early '90s, wasn't it? That Holy Ghost bartender stuff.
Well, let's talk about the divine dance a little bit. How did you meet Richard? And how did you end up co-authoring The Divine Dance, which, by the way, I'm going to plug it again. It is my favorite book on the Trinity that I've ever read. And wow. I've got a lot of degrees, Mike. I've got bachelor's, master's, doctor, and almost had a second doctorate before I went to rehab and PhD in the Hebrew Bible.
Wow.
So
you're a pretty smart guy, Fred.
Well, I've read a lot, and this is my favorite Trinity book. Wow. Definitely. So
I'm honored.
Great job. Yeah. Love it.
Thank you. Thank
Love
you.
it. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the backstory. How did you get involved in that writing project with Richard?
Yeah. To tell that backstory, I'll briefly connect a little bit of the backstory that I started telling you before. In college, major in journalism, minor in creative writing and religion. Originally thought I would be a roving newspaper journalist, but print journalism was starting to die or go through massive changes even then in the late '90s, early 2000s, and I just realized that I wouldn't be able to start and support a family on a starting journalist salary, and so. I did some soul searching and decided that I needed to go to the dark side of PR if I was going to make any money. But then decided that, hey, if I do that, I don't want to sell my soul. I would like to, publicize stuff I believe in. And so I kind of made up a career for myself in publishing and in, working with what became known at the time as the emerging church conversation. And so, long story short, in college with my college roommate, I created this website called Sights Unseen. And at its height, it was a directory of over 10,000 websites that networked together various alternative Christian phenomenon, be those websites, blogs, forums, churches, intentional communities, et cetera. And I had them all categorized, but they were all on like one giant page. Originally, it was a GeoCities page, if you remember GeoCities. And so that site brought me connections with people all over the world, brought me some notoriety. I got profiled in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They called me the tie that binds the emergent church. I try not to let that one get to my head, a 24-year-old, but yeah. And so within all that, I ended up connecting with a West Coast emerging church network called The Ooze. And the ooze.com was a big site at the time.
I remember it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, before blogs were really a thing, it was a place where people ranging from, Brian McLaren and Nadia Bolz-Weber all the way to Mark Driscoll before he differentiated himself could just like upload articles on what they were thinking about the intersection of post-modernity and Christianity. And before social media was really a thing, the Ooze had really active message boards and stuff like that where people could just, talk and converse. And so the Ooze would host a gathering called Solarize. And Solarize was one of the first places, if not the first place, to bring Richard into a post-evangelical audience.
Ah,
because the Ooze and Solar Eyes' founder, Spencer Burke, was really big into various Catholic mystics. He was a big fan of Thomas Merton, is a big fan of Thomas Keating, and of Richard. And so Richard first got brought around before I was involved with Solar Eyes. I want to say in '98, the very first Solar Eyes that happened, and but he continued to be involved in some of the things Spencer was doing. And in 2002 I went to my first Solar Eyes in Minneapolis, and rocked my world in so many ways. And I ended up volunteering as an editor for the site, as well as a links editor, which was very natural for me considering my sights unseen that I had going on. And so I started, approving or denying, requests coming in from around the world of list my congregation on your website and that kind of thing for the Ooze. And it was through that I did get to first meet Richard through, I want to say it was 2007, Solar Eyes in the Bahamas. We had it out in the Bahamas, suffering for the Lord, and yeah, and Richard actually was the very first person who typed me on the Enneagram during that conference, because there actually weren't a ton of people who showed up. A lot of congregations were stingy with their budgets and said, no, we were not going to send our pastor to the Bahamas, even though it was priced comparatively to going to Omaha or something.
right.
So, there's only about 100 people there. And so we all got a lot of time with Richard, with N.T. Wright was also there. Brennan Manning was also there.
Oh,
It was
nice.
such an amazing group of people.
Cool.
This woman, Rita Brock. But yeah, so I got to know Richard through helping with event coordination with Solar Eyes. And just as an aside, I want to put in a plug. Solar Eyes had been gone for the better part of like a dozen or more years, but it's actually coming back. There's a new Solar Eyes that's going to be happening in late May. So since I know this is airing soon, just want to say that if you go to solareyes.org, it'll be happening on the West Coast. There's no celebrity speakers or even presentations. It's a very collaborative, bottom up gathering this year. And so, it won't take any more time to talk about it now, but I'm going to try to actually make it out there. It looks to be a really special gathering. So it's cool how some of these things come back around. But then I helped start this thing called, as we were talking about earlier, the Wild Goose Festival.
Yeah.
And, being part of the founding of the Wild Goose Festival, myself and Gareth Higgins and a woman named Laurel and a guy named Jacob, we put it together. And Richard was a very strong early supporter and was out at our first couple of Wild Goose Festivals.
What year did that start?
2011.
Okay. As I told you, I went last year for the first time. Brian McLaren had encouraged me to go, and
sounds like he dared you.
Yeah, right.
Double dog dare you.
Yeah, right. But since then, so some of my listeners have listened to quite a few interviews with people that I met there. Stan Mitchell probably be one of them that you would know well.
Yeah.
But I could name a bunch of others. But I even did Frank Schaefer and I connected, even though he wasn't there. We connected through another friend. And
Frank is such a goose presence. Like Richard, he's been a big supporter from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. So when that was 2011, and that was kind of that was when the emergent movement was still kind of would have been the tail end of that, or the early or the latter part of that. And then,
I mean, I don't know. We can parse it different ways. Some would say that the emerging church died by like the early 2010s. Some would say that it achieved its ultimate victory and, began to super influence mainline congregations and, and morphed into an even more diffuse movement known as progressive Christianity. And certainly Wild Goose, has become the cornerstone gathering of that kind of space. So, I mean, my quick and dirty sociological take on that is that, the golden era of emerging church conversation was late 90s through about 2004. So I want to say like 97 through 2004 was basically a conversation of the people who were asking the questions for the people who were asking the questions. And then in 2004, a Christianity Today cover story came out called The Emergent Mystique. And it was, largely a criticism. And then it began drawing the attention of evangelical scholars like D.A. Carson and others. And, the young, restless, and reformed movement of the time, the neo-Calvinist bros. And at that point, suddenly we weren't just able to have our own conversation. It's kind of like what happens with terminology, like what happened with the term woke, how woke was originally a term within the Black community to talk about being vigilant, being awake to injustice. But then when right wingers got a hold of it, it became a slur. Similarly, back in the mid 2000s, emergent became a slur for everything we don't like. And at that time, evangelical media still had, some sway. I would say that now, while it's still quite loud, it's in its last gasps of relevance and really beyond relevance in so many ways. But at the time, we could no longer really have the conversations we wanted without having to defend every syllable we uttered. And that just really changed the contour of everything.
Yeah.
But I'd say by the early 2010s, evangelicals got a little tired of fighting with us, at least for a while. And, the movement began to morph and differentiate itself and go into mainline, denominations like Episcopals, Disciples of Christ, UCC, et cetera, where this wasn't controversial, where they appreciated the infusion of new life, even though it was challenging for them in some ways, how us post-evangelical emergents were also wanting to rethink not just beliefs, but praxis, rethink how church is done, sort of aesthetically and organizationally, et cetera. But yeah, that was an interesting hinge point. You're right. Like Wild Goose, I think you could say is the outgrowth of a lot of those early conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, cool. I've interviewed Doug Pagitt. He was coming through Kansas City a few months ago, and I said, well, come hang out with me, so we
Awesome.
stayed with me, and we had a little bit of conversation around that too. Kind of interesting perspective. I tease him because when he was starting that leadership network thing, he made the cutoff age. You had to be born 1964 or after, and I was born 61. And I was like, Doug, you could have saved me from this crash and burn that I went through. Maybe you'd have let me in. I tried to get in.
Yeah. You could have joined, the Terra Nova Project, became Young Leaders, became Emergent Village back in the day. Could have been
exactly. Anyway, I was just
So I was on the other end of the spectrum, very young when all that stuff was happening. I was often the youngest guy in the room at places like Solar Eyes or the Emergent YS conventions that happened in Nashville. But I was interested in the conversation, and yeah, through that sort of event planning hat I wore, that's how I got to know Richard. And then through my publishing hat, I have this network called Speakeasy, and we do book launches for authors and publishers in contemplative and progressive Christianity, as well as interfaith titles. And so I've gotten to work with hundreds of amazing authors and really great publishing houses over the last 16 years or so. And one of those publishers, a dear friend of mine, Don Milam, and Don also has a background in the charismatic movement. In fact, he was the vice president of Destiny Image Publishing for many years, and to this day works with Whitaker House, which is a charismatic publisher. Yeah. And so
interesting.
But I always knew Don from my Berry College days to be way more widely read than that. He was very into St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and various Jewish thinkers and Christian mystics, as well as Robert Farrar Capon, who just brilliant writer on Scandalous Grace.
I don't know him personally, but I've read his stuff.
Yeah.
Brennan Manning liked Capon a lot, I think, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. His book on the parables is fantastic, and thought-provoking. Between Noon and Three is excellent. So I always knew Don to be more widely read than what he tended to publish, but a number of years ago, when his beloved wife, Mickey, passed away from cancer, he was really impacted by Richard's book, Falling Upward. And, looking at sort of a second half of life, spirituality, was really moved by it. And he's like, Mike, I'd love to publish Richard. Can you, make some kind of an introduction? And I said, yeah. I said, publishing Richard would be a fantastic idea, Don. And honestly, I have a book I would like to write of Richard's. I said, he at the time, another contemplative teacher that kind of swims in the same circles with Richard, Cynthia Bourgeau, had published a book called The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three. And
so I have her name written down here on my things that I wanted to talk to you about.
well,
Dance because, well, as I told you, I was reading your footnotes, and that one stuck out to me about the difference between two, dualism, binary, and three.
Yes,
that whole thing. And then you also referenced in the footnote this. I don't know how to say his name. That G.I. Gurdjieff. How do you say it?
Different people pronounce it differently. You can pronounce it Gurdjieff, or if you want to be like more authentic to the sort of Armenian, Turkish pronunciation, it's more like Gurdjieff.
Yeah, but that footnote with those two authors really intrigued me in that whole concept. So you finish your story about the come full circle with the beginning of writing the book, and then I kind of want to dive into that.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff to drill down into. You're very astute. So I knew, because at that point I was like a Richard Rohr audio junkie. Like, I always preferred listening to him than reading him. And so, the Center for Action and Contemplation, released a lot of different recordings of different conferences he had done. And so he did a pair of conferences, gosh, at this point, well over a decade ago, called The Shape of God, and then one called The Divine Dance. And at the Shape of God conference, that was the first time that Richard and Cynthia had met each other. And her material from that conference became the core of the Holy Trinity and the Law of Three, her Trinity book. And, with what became Speakeasy, my most successful book I've ever promoted, hands down, for the rest of my life, will probably be The Shack. I was a part of the early launch team for The Shack, and weirdly enough, I'm a back cover endorser on the book. So I'm sandwiched between Michael W. Smith and Wynonna Judd for some unknown reason.
Hey,
So it's like my name is on the back of 26 million printed pieces of paper. That's awesome. Crazy.
Awesome.
And I was very influenced by Paul's vision of the Trinity and his very relational and parabolic telling of that inner relationship.
I love
indelibly marked, my spiritual journey. And so I saw that resonance in Richard's material from the Shape of God and Divine Dance conferences. And it was sort of like, well, Cynthia has a Trinity book now, which I also quite enjoy. It's like, Richard should have a Trinity book. And at the time, I thought that Richard regularly used ghostwriters because, there would be a conference one year that the CAC would hold, Breathing Underwater, for instance, and the next year a book would come out by the same title. And usually in the publishing world, that's a tell that an author is working with ghostwriters who take the transcripts from their conferences and work them into written form. So I didn't think I was asking anything too outrageous when I approached Richard and said, hey, I have a friend. He would like to publish you. I know you have no shortage of publishing opportunities, but I would actually love to ghostwrite a book for you based on your Trinity material. And what Richard told me was that he actually doesn't normally use ghostwriters because he's incredibly picky, that he did it once years ago and wasn't really that into it. But then he was like, but, I like you, Mike. Give me a few sample chapters and we'll see. Yeah. So with that, we were off to the races. Whitaker House commissioned me to do a few spec sample chapters, and Richard liked them and greenlit the project. And so then we began a very collaborative process back and forth. First, me creating an entire manuscript from the raw transcripts, while taking liberties, freely interjecting my own Trinitarian experiences and studies into the material, because I knew Richard was going to look at it afterward and he could take out anything that he didn't like and didn't, resonate with him. But I was really grateful that not only did it resonate with him, but he was like, Michael, you added a lot of original material to this. Like, I don't want you to just be an anonymous ghostwriter. I want you to be, get co-author byline credit.
Yeah.
And the publishers were like, yeah, that's cool, Richard, but nobody really knows Mike. So I got the with at the bottom.
Yeah.
And, it was the compromise, which is fine. I understand where they were going from. But but I was just grateful to be able to work with him on the project and that, I was able to, not only, I hope, faithfully reflect his own vibrant Trinitarian spirituality, but I was able to bring a little bit of mine to the table as well.
That's cool. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So dive in. God, there's so many things I could show you all my highlights on this book and then could have an hour conversation on every one of them. But I loved the intro that you guys did with the Russian Rublev and the famous icon.
Yes,
it's gorgeous. Let's don't. But I kind of the difference between 2 and 3. And your reference to Cynthia and Gurdorf, or however you say his name.
Gurdjieff,
Gurdjieff.
Yeah.
Talk about that a bit, because I found that to be fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
As it relates to reality, right?
It does. a lot of our Western civilization and Western philosophy is underpinned by, kind of a Cartesian dualism and also a Hegelian dialectic. And those are, fancy words that just basically mean like, we take the idea that everything in life is there's, this thesis and then there's an antithesis and then they're in conflict with each other. And then there's, maybe some kind of new synthesis that's born that's like an amalgamation of those two. And whichever one wins, whichever one comes out on top, carries the dominant theme of the day into what's next. And that would be a sort of a binary metaphysic. And what Gurdjieff gets at with something he calls the cosmic law of 3 is that, and Cynthia names it, a ternary metaphysic, a triune metaphysic. And the idea behind the law of 3, and I should pause here and say I'm barely qualified to speak on the law of 3. It's a very deep concept, and there are people who work with it their entire lives. So take this as a very quick and dirty sketch. But the idea is that, in fact, there are 3 constitutive forces in reality when we're making life decisions, when we're talking about big social movements, when we're talking about just about anything, that there is a affirming force. There's a denying force, which on first blush can sound similar to a Hegelian dialectic, but then there is a reconciling force that is not a synthesis of those two, but it's yet a third motion, what some might call grace, and that those 3 interact in unique ways and then create a fourth phenomenon on a new plane of arising. And when you add that third force in, that reconciling force, it does a few things. For one, affirming and denying are not identical with positive and negative. So affirming force could be someone declaring war and advancing a war, but they're in the affirming position of that metaphysical turn because they're the ones, advancing something. So it could be a negative thing that's being advanced. Denying force could be someone resisting that war and saying, no, it doesn't go any further than right here. But then reconciling force could be yet another group of people who might recognize the essential humanity of both of these other forces and bring people to the table in a unique way that sort of shows how to, name another one of Richard's book titles, everything belongs. Mm-hmm. For me, the law of 3 is a way of sanctifying reality. It's a way of me owning whatever pole I happen to be holding in a given, stance. Like I can recognize that I might be the affirming force in a situation or the denying force in a situation. And I can be recognizing third force or reconciling force when I see it and honoring all of us in the process. Mm. And so it's not abdicating the particularity of my place, which I feel like sometimes non-dual cosmologies just kind of dissolve into a soup of, everything's all good, man. that's not often how reality works. Like the non-duality is, I think, more about seeing the hidden wholeness that underpins everything, seeing the underside where the threads come together in the tapestry, but it doesn't mean that we cease to be distinct threads.
Mm.
And so, law of three is one way of
Mm.
recognizing and honoring that process. And Gurdjieff also called the law of three the law of universe creation, because he said this is how new things are built, because these three forces come together, create a fourth on a new arising, not unlike how in the opening of the Divine Dance, Richard introduces this idea that I have to say, art historians haven't been too enthusiastic about, but the idea that there's glue on the front of Rublev's Trinity and that it used to hold a mirror there. I think that the spiritual truth is valid regardless of what may or may not be the case historically. Right. But the idea is that there's, the gaze between the Father, Son, and Spirit, as we traditionally name these three forces, and that in that gaze is the hidden fourth member of the Trinity, which is us, which is cosmos, which is creation, which is all reality. And so, I think that it's kind of like a water wheel in motion. It shows the possibilities of honoring the relationality of reality. And to me, that's the heart of what Trinity means. Like, if God is relationship in a meaningful way, and if that's how we Christians come at the sort of monotheism club in a very strange way that our Jewish and Muslim siblings in spirit are like, what are you talking about? Are you idolaters?
Right.
And we're like, no, man, the one is not in the community. And so if that's the case, like,
just try the right mushroom and you'll get
it. Right, you'll get it. And I think that the contemplatives do in so many of the traditions, but it's like, if God is relationship, if God is multiplicity, but also unity because of relationship, and we claim that we are made in the Imago Dei, or as I like to cheekily say, the Imago Trei, then, how do we then live? How can we live our lives? And I think that practical leaning into the law of three and seeing how everything belongs, including the role that I have to play. It's kind of like the Ram Dass quote, something to the effect of, everything is perfect exactly as it is, including my desire to change it. And it's just like, that's just such a good perspective for me to hold, at least in my life.
That's beautiful, man. I always just talk unity and diversity, but I just love the way you parse that out with all of those ideas, interplaying into that. Really beautiful. One of my friends here locally, a colleague, is Paul Smith. I don't know if you ever met him or not, but
I sure have.
Yeah, he's a big Ken Wilber fan, and he wrote a book called Integral Christianity or something like that, which both Wilber and Richard wrote I think a forward and a afterword or something on it.
I love Paul's work, and I love the Integral Christian Network that he founded that continues to bring all kinds of really cool practices to the table, including what Paul calls like we space. And Richard and I try to get at that too with the exercises that are in the back of the book. I don't know if you've ever tried any of those out, but they can be pretty potent.
I've done. In fact, this morning I do every Tuesday morning. This is a Tuesday we're talking on. At 9:00, I do a centering prayer. I'm also doing training with mindfulness meditation with Jack, as I told Jack Cornfield and Tara Brock. But then but the centering prayer group is there's a guy named Jack Willem, who was actually on Richard's board with the Center for Action and Contemplation for several years. And it's a group of old guys who get together. Sorry, Jack, if you're listening to this, or any guys that listen to it. No, but we do a centering prayer practice where we do a 20-minute sit, and then read a couple of read something from Just This, Richard's little thing, and then just reflect on that kind of stuff. But
that's awesome.
I'm curious, since we jumped on that, what what do you see as the difference, or is there a difference between, because I feel like I'm new to all of this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sitting in contemplation or sitting in, mindfulness meditation with my brain is really challenging. And, and so as I've learned, it is for most everybody. Right. But yeah, I was wondering, is there a difference between contemplative prayer and what we might call mindfulness meditation? There's certainly overlap. I'm trying to figure out if there's a difference or not.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I was going to ask you even before you asked me the question. Have you read any of Cynthia's work?
No, and that's is one of those ones where I haven't got to it yet. I'm chasing down all these books.
There, Ecclesiastes wrote of the writing of books, there is no end. And I think, man, you wrote that thousands of years ago. If you could only see today, the publishing statistic I put out there is like, I think these days, like 2 to 3 million books titles a year are published in the English language alone when you count, ebook releases and self-pub. So, no shame. There's so many books out there. But if you're doing the training with Cornfield and you already have a centering prayer practice, I think you would really find some good clarity, or at least food for thought, in a couple of Cynthia's books. One is called Centering Prayer and Inner Awakening. And her sequel to that she released just a few years ago, I want to say, is called The Heart of Centering Prayer. And so what I'm about to say in response to your question is, in some ways cribbed from her, but it maps with my own experience. And that is that a lot of mindfulness meditation practices, as they've come to us through transcendental meditation and various Eastern practices, are concentrative practices. The idea is that we're maybe focusing on a point, or we're focusing on clearing our mind. Whereas centering prayer, as it developed from influence through the English mystical classic, The Cloud of Unknowing, is a surrender practice. And so, some people who are proponents of mindfulness meditation actually criticize centering prayer, saying it's more like a drunken practice, because you're not trying to clear your mind. You're not trying to stop your thoughts. In fact, it's built into the process that you're assuming thoughts are going to continue coming while you're there on the mat. And it's more about a releasing. It's about exercising this kind of inner muscle of the mind and really of the heart, where we are letting go of each thought as it comes. And, Cynthia's take, and I believe that Basil Pennington and Father Menninger and Thomas Keating, who sort of innovated centering prayer, endorsed this perspective, signed off on it, was that the goal of centering prayer is to become useful precisely the moment we leave our meditation cushion. That if we practice this sort of inner muscle of the heart, continually releasing, continuing letting go into our sacred word, into the presence and love of God every time a thought of any kind comes up, suddenly it's easier, if we're caught off in traffic, to feel that and let it go. It's sort of a catch and release kind of mechanism. And so it's a centering prayer, I think at its best, is it's a kenotic practice, and it's a tantric practice. And by tantric, I mean sort of embracing the idea of life, of God, of love being abundantly available and supportive through kenosis, meaning that, like that great Philippians hymn where, Jesus doesn't consider equality with God something that he clung to, but instead, taking the form of a servant, lets go of it, releases it. That he does that, and it's like a centering prayer motion of release, because he trusts ultimately in the provision of his divine Father. He trusts that more will continue to pour through, so he doesn't have to store or collect or hold on to those energies. And mindfulness meditation, equally valid practice, but it's more of an ascetic practice. Instead of a tantric practice, it's an ascetic practice that says we're going to accumulate these energies inside of us. We're going to store them. We're going to clear our mind. We're going to see how much we can hold inside to serve us. And so it's, ascetic and tantric are two different spiritual approaches, and they both have very time-honored lineages. They both have critiques of the other. But Cynthia makes the case in that material, as well as in her book, Wisdom Jesus, also echoed by a guy named James Reho in a book called Tantric Jesus, that Jesus is more of a tantric teacher. He wasn't into fasting. He was into feasting. He was into living it up in the sort of lushness of life and lushness of the world, and then outpoured from that. He always thought his cup would be filled again. So in his healing ministry, in his meal sharing, it wasn't ascetic, it wasn't conserving, it was pouring out, but not in a way that left him dry, because he always knew how to draw again from that well. And I think, and ideally, that's something that centering prayer can do. It's, like every practice, spiritually speaking, I think there's a sweet spot between figuring out what works for our disposition as well as what might stretch us at least a little bit, but not beyond the breaking point. So some people, can actually get into the contemplative zone a lot better through using rosary or other more kinesthetic praying methods. And, the ancient mystics, before centering prayer was sort of reified out of it, would say that there were various practices like Lectio Divina, divine reading, or rosary, that brought us up to the precipice of contemplatio, of the contemplative stage. But then from there, it's this work of grace in our hearts that allows us to fully enter into that zone. So I think there are a lot of different ways to get there. And I hope that gets to a little bit of your question about possible distinctions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Man, I want to honor your time, because you've got a little bit of time. I could go for hours. But I wanted to refer people to your website, MikeMorrell.org.
Yeah.
MikeMorrell.org. And by the way, I got through most of your interview that you had there with Dr. J, Jerome Lube. And thanks for doing that. That was really, because I do a lot of interviews with mental health, recovery, different things like that. And I'll bring on health professionals to talk about some of that stuff periodically. And I really appreciated that. So, and there's a link on your website to that interview with you and Dr. J. I thought that was really great.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting to hear how your journey, your spiritual journey, your contemplative practices, and your mental health have all gelled together.
They all drive each other.
That's where I'm at. I really think mental health is a spiritual practice, really. If you,
Yeah, it's, my lifelong struggles with anxiety are part of what drew me to the contemplative path, for sure. And Dr. Jerome's a good friend. Yeah, highly encourage anyone to seek that out. I don't know if you could put it in any kind of show notes or anything, that particular interview, but would also love to, offer a gift to your listeners. Like, if you've enjoyed this conversation around the divine dance, I actually give away a bonus chapter of that book on my blog. So if you go to Mike Morrell, MORRELL.org/bonus chapter, I give away a bonus chapter where it's stuff that, Whitaker House, as gracious as they were putting me on the cover, weren't going to let me include in the book, which is some of my own personal and mystical experiences around the Trinity and what inspired me to want to be a part of this project. And so I get to share some of my own story there. And we also share the first 3 chapters of the book itself and some bonus practices that aren't in the regular book, ways to practice contemplative spirituality with others. I mean, there is one solo practice in there, but the idea is, if we're in this imago Trei, if God is community, how can we do these practices with one another in a wonderful, grounded way? And so I give all that away as a download, and you also get my optimistic meditations newsletter, which you can unsubscribe anytime, but continue to share those kinds of reflections. So if you're listening to this, sounds intriguing, MikeMorrell.org/bonus chapter, it can be yours.
Yeah, great website. Plus, you access your blogs, and I would encourage everybody to do that. I enjoyed the bonus chapter as well, and I've been practicing quite a few of those types of things in these different settings that I'm in, with both centering prayer as well as mindfulness meditation, and we do some of that even with. I'm in a mindful meditation group, and
awesome.
Similar practices. So yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. I know you got to run, but thanks. I'm so glad after 3 years we connect, and maybe, are you going to be at Wild Goose this year?
I will be at Wild Goose this year. And yeah, last year I was back and forth for various reasons. I wasn't even on site a lot. So no wonder you couldn't find me. But yeah, Fred, let's see if we can get together this summer.
Paths will cross again, and maybe we can catch a conversation there. And I look forward to connecting in person.
Beautiful, Fred. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures. And we will connect with you next time. Take care. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.